The introduction of Part O of the building regulations and its supporting approved documents have been prompted by climate change research, which forecasts that large parts of the UK are going to see significant occurrences of overheating in most housing types within the next 10 years or so. There's also been numerous media reports about householders experience thermal discomfort, having negative impacts on their sleep patterns, in particularly in apartments and flats. And of course, we all remember the heat wave in the UK last summer, coincidentally around the same time as we did our first Part O webinar, and the heat waves that have been widespread across Southern Europe this year, culminating in devastating wildfires in Greece. And if that isn't a final call to take action to mitigate climate change, what is? So as one newspaper headline asked earlier this week, are we fiddling while roads burns? So I think this is probably a good time to review 12 months on of the impact of the new requirements of Part O through the latest research we've commissioned. But before we do that, I think it's also useful to have a quick refresher on some of the key elements of Part O. So as a reminder, building regulations in England, and it's also the case in Wales, are divided up into separate parts, which usually set out the high level functional requirements of the building regulations. And then approved documents provide ways in which compliance with those functional requirements can be met. Guidance in the approved documents is not mandatory. There are other ways in which you can demonstrate compliance, but they tend to be the most commonly adopted routes to compliance. So we have Part O of the building regulations, which sets out the requirements for mitigating overheating in new dwellings. And then we have the approved document, which gives ways in which those functional requirements can be met. So in England, approved document O was published on the 15th of December 2021 and came into force on the 15th of June 2022. There then followed a transitional period or transitional arrangements, which this time were limited to 12 months and were based on individual buildings rather than whole developments or plots or sites. The scope of the regulations covers new residential buildings only, so it doesn't apply to conservatories or extensions which are subsequently added to existing dwellings. The intention of the new regulation is to limit unwanted solar gains in summer and provide adequate means for removing excess heat from indoor environments. In the approved document, O, it contains two methods for demonstrating compliance. There's a simplified method, which is largely a prescriptive-based approach, and there's a dynamic thermal modelling method, which provides opportunity for more flexibility. Urban and suburban areas of London are categorised as high-risk locations, with the rest of England considered as moderate risk. Strictly speaking, the standard or the minimum standard for Manchester is moderate risk. However, governments have advised designers that they may want to follow the guidance for high-risk locations for buildings located in central Manchester, as elevated nighttime temperatures may be experienced in those locations. In fact, if you look at the approved document, it does actually give a list of postcodes for Manchester for which this may be considered. And I think it'll be interesting to see the results of the survey later on, whether architects think that this is sufficient or whether there's high-rise locations elsewhere in England that could be at risk. So we don't tend to go into detail at this point on the methods of compliance, but we are just going to pick out some key elements of the simplified method because it does identify some acceptable solutions. So for high-rise locations, it identifies external shutters with ventilation, overhangs such as brise-soleil or awnings, which can cut off the sun if it's at 50-degree altitude or higher. And it also identifies a potential solution through glass, which has a maximum G value of 0.40 and a minimum light transmission of 0.70. If you're not aware of the property of the G value is essentially the total amount of the sun's heat which passes through the glass, both directly and re-radiated afterwards, being absorbed. This can be expressed from a scale from 0 to 1 as an absolute number, or sometimes it's expressed as a percentage. So sometimes a G value of 0.40 will be indicated as 40%. And it's also worth pointing out the G value in this particular context applies to the glass only, ignoring the frames. A few words about Wales. The corresponding requirements in Wales, which are also covered by Part O and the supporting documents, approved document O, took effect a little bit later than England on the 23rd of November 2022. And although they're broadly similar to the requirements in England, there are some differences. So, for example, there's no categorising of high risk and moderate risk locations in Wales. The whole of Wales are subject to the same requirements. In terms of glazing solutions for the simplified method, then again, glass with a G value 0.40 is identified, but unlike for England, there's no reference to a minimum light transmission. If we quickly do a summary of the situation in Scotland, so new requirements in the technical handbook for domestic buildings was published, and it came into effect on the 1st of February this year, slightly delayed from the original time of the 1st of December last year. So you can find these requirements in section 3.28, the overheating section of the technical handbook. And similar to England, it provides a simple method rather than a simplified method, but I think that's just semantics, which again sets out to limit solar gain through the glazing. As well as a simplified method, there's also the opportunity to use a dynamic thermal analysis method, particularly for more complex dwellings or where you've got large areas of glazing. And while we're on the subject of glazing, then in the simplified method, if you have a glazed area greater than 20% of the floor area, then you have a couple of options. You can provide shading, for example, external shutters, or you can decrease the G value, the default G value for the glass, which is set to 0.60 or 60%, to reduce the solar gains in proportion to the increased in glazed area. As I say, we didn't intend to go through the whole of approved document O again, because we covered that in our webinar around 12 months ago, and this is still available. So if you want to know a bit more detail, particularly around the impact on glass, then our webinar is still available. So you can find it on YouTube, or if you look at the Pilkington TV channel, or on our website. And there's also a link in this presentation. So it's advisable, if you haven't already seen the video, it's worth checking it out. I guess it's a little bit like when season 2 of a TV show drops and you haven't had a chance to watch season 1 yet. So that's still available on our website. So moving on to the main topic of discussion for today, and I'd like to introduce you to the research that we commissioned. So we polled 100 architects specialising in the residential sector, and this was carried out independently through a research agency called Census Wide, and the survey was carried out between the 13th and 17th of July 2023, so it's quite up to date. We will be releasing a feature on this research in the near future. But if you can't wait until then and you'd like to know a bit more about the survey, some of the nuts and bolts and the mechanics behind it, then please feel free to contact James afterwards. So growing up watching Family Fortunes, this is something I've always wanted to say. Our survey says, so 1 year of Part O, what have we learned? Then what we found out is that regulatory reform is only part of the bigger picture. So our survey also found that, as well as Part O being a driver itself, in addressing overheating in homes. We also find that climate itself and the energy crisis is also having a significant impact. So when we asked architects what they thought was the biggest factor in influence measures for driving change in the residential sector over the next few years, 40% responded to say that Part O and the enforcement is going to drive higher performing product in the sector. 32% picked out extreme heat waves and the weather patterns and the impact that has on comfort. So 32% identified that as the biggest factor. And the third biggest factor at 26% was energy efficiency improvements. We've also found that architects are generally adapting well to the new regulations. So when we asked them how easy or difficult they found it in terms of demonstrating compliance, then a small majority was found to say that it was easy to comply. So around 57% said it was easy to comply. But there are some challenges. So of the remaining 43%, excuse me, then 15% actually responded to say that they're finding it difficult to comply with the regulations. And then the remaining 28% were finding it neither easy nor difficult. Solar control glass specifications are rising. So respondents said that 70% of respondents said that they are now specifying more solar control glass since the introduction of the new requirements. And we've also seen that ourselves, you know, as a business, we've seen a greater demand for solar control glass going into residential projects in the UK. We've actually responded to this demand by introducing products specifically targeted at that sector. So, for example, 4mm Suncool 7035. So in an area where typically solar control glass would be used in commercial buildings, we're now finding the products are being modified or adapted or improved for the residential sector, and we're expecting this to continue. Leading on from this, our research also found that 80% agree that solutions like solar control glass are becoming increasingly important in new homes as the country becomes accustomed to experiencing more and more heat waves. What are the other measures which are being used to combat overheating? Well, when we asked what measures are commonly incorporated into new residential projects to limit overheating, 30% of architects identified improving ventilation as the key element. 26% identified the use of solar control glass. 20% highlighted smaller windows or reduced glazed areas. 14% highlighted air conditioning, and 7% identified shading. The rest indicated no specific measure. But there are obviously challenges with some of these measures. So, for example, if you're tempted to reduce window sizes, this can make the properties less attractive to homeowners with less natural daylight coming in. This can impact on health and well-being. And if working from home, that can also impact on productivity. And also reducing glazed areas can actually reduce the contribution that passive solar gains can make during the winter. Overall, architects seem to have a good appetite to go above and beyond regulations, according to our survey. So 91% of those polled said they go above and beyond the minimum requirements in Part O. And the split of that 91% is 14% say they always go beyond the minimum requirements. 30% indicated that they often go beyond the minimum requirements. And 47% say they sometimes do, with only 9% saying they just do the minimum to meet the requirements. This is quite encouraging, I think. But the message here, there is a message here for product manufacturers that they shouldn't rest on their laurels. They shouldn't simply focus on developing new products or modifying existing products just to meet the minimum requirements. They should be looking at products that can go beyond that. So that's quite an encouraging finding from the survey. Part O's two-tier approach has also been challenged. So by the two-tier approach, what we mean is the distinction between high risk and moderate risk locations for those adopting the simplified method. So 71% agreed that there's a missed opportunity to combat overheating by limiting the strictest measures only to London and central Manchester. This approach was also described as crude in the Future Home Hub's Part O technical guidance document that came out a few months ago, pointing out that some parts of the south of England, outside of London, can experience hot, sunny and still periods. Also, in urban areas, there can be heat island effects, where elevated temperatures can be experienced in towns and cities, particularly at night time, as the heat is retained by the surfaces of the building, which are then slowly released, keeping the temperatures higher. So this is one area which may need to be considered in any future review of this particular part of the building regulations. Although obviously you have to point out that the dynamic thermal modelling approach does actually provide access to a wider range of weather data, so you can be a little bit more specific about where the development is located. But I think this is one area that perhaps needs consideration. So what are the key observations that have come out from our survey? Well, alongside climate and energy efficiency, then Part O is one of the three key factors influencing greater measures to mitigate overheating in residential buildings. We've seen that architects are going above and beyond minimum requirements in the interest of occupier comfort as heat waves become more extreme, and also to support energy savings and energy efficiency, and also to fit in with the wider sustainability aspirations. We've seen there's also appetite for maybe Part O to have more robust minimum requirements, particularly around the limitations of the two-tier approach in the simplified method, where it separates out high risk and moderate risk areas.